The Wyoming wind howled a mournful song across the plains near the Medicine Bow River, but a sound sharper and more terrifying cut through it, the snarl of wolves and the thin, desperate cry of a child. For Clara Thornton, a woman carving a solitary life from this unforgiving frontier, that cry presented a stark choice. A choice that would plunge her into a storm of danger, shatter her isolated world, and forge a destiny she never could have imagined. What happens when one act of raw courage ignites a firestorm of consequences? This is the story of how saving a single life meant risking everything, and how the untamed heart of the West truly changed one woman forever. The late autumn air bit at Clara Thornton's exposed cheeks, carrying the scent of pine and the metallic tang of approaching snow. Her small, sturdy cabin, nestled in a shallow valley a few miles from the sluggish gray-green waters of the Medicine Bow River, felt like the only bastion of warmth in a 100-mile radius. She'd chosen this isolation after the war between the states had taken everything but her resolve. Here the silence was usually a companion, broken only by the wind, the call of a hawk, or the distant lowing of the wilder cattle she occasionally managed to hunt. Today, however, the silence was ripped asunder. Clara was chopping firewood, the rhythmic thud of her axe against seasoned pine, a steady beat against the vast emptiness. Her buckskin trousers, worn soft with use, and a thick woolen shirt did little to entirely fend off the cold, but the exertion kept her blood moving. She was a woman forged by hardship, her frame lean but strong, her eyes the color of a stormy sky reflecting a resilience that had seen her through loss and loneliness. A sound, faint at first, pricked her ears. She paused, axe mid-swing, her head tilted. It was a high-pitched wail, almost lost in the wind's mournful sigh. An animal. A coyote pup, perhaps. She dismissed it, raising the axe again. Then it came again, clearer this time, sharper, undeniably human. A child's cry. Clara's heart lurched. Children were a rarity in this remote stretch of Wyoming territory. The nearest settlement, a dusty collection of a dozen buildings, optimistically named Prosperity Gulch, was a hard 2-day ride east. The only other humans she encountered with any regularity were taciturn trappers passing through, or the occasional wary band of Cheyenne or Arapaho, whose ancestral lands these were. Dropping the axe, she snatched her Winchester rifle from where it leaned against the woodpile. Her movements were economical, practiced. Fear was a luxury she rarely indulged, but a cold knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. A child alone out here, with winter breathing down their necks. She scanned the sparse tree line that marked the edge of her small clearing, then moved towards the low ridge that offered a better vantage point. The cries were more insistent now, laced with a terror that made Clara's own breath catch. As she crested the ridge, her gaze swept the undulating frost-kissed grasslands, stretching towards the river. And then she saw them. A pack of grey wolves, 6 of them lean and hungry-looking, their coats blending with the muted colors of the landscape. They were circling something small and dark, huddled at the base of a jagged rock formation, the source of the cries. Even from this distance, Clara could see the desperation in the wolves' movements, the way they darted in and out, testing, waiting. "Damn fools," she muttered, her voice a low growl. Without a second thought, she chambered around the metallic click, sharp in the cold air. There was no time to weigh the risks, no time to consider the implications. A child was in mortal danger. Her descent down the other side of the ridge was swift but careful, her worn leather boots finding purchase on the loose scree. The wind was at her back, carrying her scent away from the wolves, a small mercy. As she drew closer, the scene resolved into horrifying clarity. The child, no more than 4 or 5 years old, was wrapped in what looked like a tattered deerskin. Dark hair matted with dirt, and possibly blood, framed a small face contorted in fear. The child was backed against the rocks, a tiny futile stick clutched in one hand. One of the larger wolves, bolder than the others, lunged. The child screamed a raw, piercing sound that tore at Clara's soul. Clara didn't shout. She didn't waste energy on warnings the beasts wouldn't understand. She brought the Winchester to her shoulder, sighted down the barrel, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her, the report echoing across the plains. The lead wolf yelped a choked sound and stumbled, its hind leg collapsing. The pack scattered momentarily, startled by the gunshot, looking back with intelligent yellow eyes. The wounded wolf snarled, trying to drag itself away. Clara fired again, a clean shot that silenced it. Animals deserved a swift end, even predatory ones. Now the remaining 5 wolves were focused on her, their initial surprise giving way to a wary aggression. They fanned out low to the ground, their lips curled back from sharp teeth. Clara stood her ground, her expression grim. She knew wolves. They were smart, and they were persistent, especially when driven by hunger. "Get back, you devils!" she yelled, this time her voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. She took a deliberate step forward, chambering another round with a decisive click-clack. One wolf, perhaps the alpha, now took a hesitant step towards her, then another, a low growl rumbling in its chest. Clara aimed carefully, not to kill this time, but to warn. She fired into the dirt just in front of its paws. The wolf leaped back with a yelp, showering itself with clods of earth. The others flinched. This was a battle of wills, as much as of firepower. Clara held their gaze, her own unwavering. She was the intruder here, the one challenging their hunt. But she would not yield. Slowly, reluctantly, the pack began to retreat, melting back into the tall grasses, their eyes still fixed on her, until they disappeared over a rise. Only when they were gone did Clara allow herself a shaky breath. The adrenaline still coursed through her veins, making her hands tremble slightly. She reloaded the Winchester, her gaze constantly scanning the horizon, before turning her attention to the child. As she approached the child, who she now saw was a boy, scrambled further against the rocks, his dark eyes wide with a terror that hadn't subsided with the wolves' departure. He was small for his age, his limbs thin, his face smudged with grime and tears. His deerskin wrap was indeed torn, and a dark stain was spreading on one shoulder. Cheyenne. The beadwork on a strip of his clothing, though simple, was distinctive. Clara knelt slowly, keeping her movements gentle, non-threatening. She placed the rifle on the ground beside her, within easy reach, but not pointed at him. "It's all right," she said, her voice softer now, though still raspy from the encounter. "They're gone. You're safe." The boy just stared, his breathing shallow and rapid. He didn't understand her words, of course. He flinched when she reached a hand out slowly. "Easy now," Clara murmured. "I'm not going to hurt you." She pointed to herself. "Clara." Then she pointed to him, a questioning look on her face. He remained silent, his eyes darting from her face to the rifle, then back to the empty plains where the wolves had vanished. He was clearly in shock and likely injured. The blood on his shoulder was concerning. Clara knew this was a dangerous situation, far more complex than just fending off a wolf pack. Taking in a Cheyenne child, even to save his life, was fraught with peril. His people would be looking for him. And what if they found her with him? They might assume the worst, that she had stolen him or worse, harmed his family. The settlers in Prosperity Gulch, few as they were, held deep-seated prejudices. They wouldn't understand. Some might even see it as a provocation. But looking at the small, trembling figure, at the raw fear in his eyes, Clara couldn't bring herself to leave him. He wouldn't survive another night alone, not with an injury and the cold deepening. The wolves or the elements would claim him. "You're hurt," she said more to herself than to him. "We need to get that looked at." She gestured towards his shoulder, then mimed tending a wound. He recoiled slightly, a whimper escaping his lips. His dark eyes, however, held a flicker of something other than just fear. A nascent understanding, perhaps, or maybe just the desperate hope of a child clinging to any potential rescuer. Clara sat back on her heels, giving him space. The wind whipped around them, a constant reminder of their vulnerability. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and purple, beautiful but also a warning. Nightfall on the plains came swiftly, and with it deeper cold and renewed danger. She had to make a decision. Her solitary life was hard, but it was predictable, manageable. This child was a stone dropped into the still waters of her existence, and the ripples she sensed would be far-reaching and unpredictable. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the vast landscape, Clara made her choice. She couldn't leave him. It wasn't in her nature. She'd faced down death before. She'd lost her husband, her home, her past life. What was one more risk, one more unknown, in a life already defined by them? "All right, little one," she said softly, her voice imbued with a resolve that surprised even herself. "Looks like you and I are in this together, at least for now." She rose slowly, picked up her rifle, and then, moving with infinite gentleness, reached down again. This time she didn't try to touch his wound, but instead offered her hand palm up. The boy watched her, his chest still heaving. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then hesitantly, as if drawn by an invisible thread of warmth in the cold, indifferent wilderness, his small, dirt-stained hand reached out and tentatively touched hers. His fingers were icy. Clara's heart, a muscle she thought had hardened beyond feeling clenched with a strange protective ache, as she carefully helped him to his feet, supporting his injured side. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that this single act, this unplanned instinctive intervention, was about to change her life forever. The path ahead was shrouded in mist, but she had set her feet upon it. There was no turning back now. The silence of the plains had been broken, and a new, dangerous, and perhaps even meaningful chapter had begun. I will now proceed to write part 2, focusing on Clara caring for the child, the reactions of her community, even if just an encounter with someone, and the rising tension further integrating the real name of the Medicine Bow River region. Part 2. An Uneasy Haven. The journey back to Clara's cabin was slow and arduous. The boy, whom she'd mentally started calling Little Fox for his dark, wary eyes and the tattered remains of what might have been a fox fur trim on his deerskin wrap, leaned heavily against her. He was weak, his small body occasionally racked with tremors that had nothing to do with the cold. Clara kept her Winchester, cradled in one arm, her gaze sweeping their surroundings, ever vigilant for the return of the wolves or any other threat. The plains, so open and seemingly empty, could hide dangers in every fold of land, every shadowed coulee. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time they reached the relative safety of her cabin. The single room with its stone fireplace, rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a built-in bunk felt like a palace of warmth and security after the biting wind outside. Little Fox's eyes, wide and dark, took in the unfamiliar surroundings with a mixture of fear and awe. He'd probably never been inside a white person's dwelling before. Clara settled him gently on a 3-legged stool near the hearth, where the embers of her morning fire still glowed. "Stay put," she said, her voice soft but firm, as she added kindling and small logs, coaxing the flames back to life. The flickering light cast dancing shadows on the boy's face, highlighting the pallor beneath the grime. Once the fire was crackling, offering a comforting warmth, Clara turned her attention to his injury. "All right, little fox," she murmured, more to soothe herself than him. "Let's see to that shoulder." She fetched her medical supplies, a small wooden box containing dried herbs, clean linen strips, a bottle of potent home-brewed antiseptic, smelling strongly of alcohol and willow bark, and a needle and sinew thread. These were tools of survival, as essential as her axe or rifle. The boy flinched violently when she approached his good hand, coming up to ward her off. His dark eyes were filled with suspicion. "Easy, easy," Clara crooned, kneeling beside him. "Shh, I need to clean it or it'll get it bad. See?" She touched her own shoulder, then mimed cleaning a wound. "Hurts now, feels better later." She spoke slowly, her tone gentle, hoping the intent would translate even if the words didn't. He didn't relax, but he didn't try to bolt either, watching her every move with an unnerving intensity. With painstaking care, Clara eased the tattered deerskin away from his injured shoulder. The wound was uglier than she'd thought, 2 deep puncture marks, likely from a wolf's fangs, surrounded by torn flesh and considerable bruising. It was bleeding sluggishly, the blood dark against his skin. It needed cleaning, and badly. The first touch of the warm, damp cloth made him cry out a sharp, animalistic sound of pain that tore at Clara. He struggled, trying to pull away. I know it hurts," Clara said, her voice tight with empathy. "But we have to. Hold still now, just a little longer." She held him firmly but gently, her larger frame easily overpowering his weak struggles. She worked quickly, cleaning away the dirt and dried blood. Her touch surprisingly deft for hands, more accustomed to the rough work of the frontier. When she applied the stinging antiseptic, he gasped and tears streamed down his face, but he didn't fight her as much, perhaps sensing the grim necessity of her actions. The wound wasn't deep enough to require stitches, thankfully, but it was nasty. Clara applied a poultice of crushed yarrow and plantain leaves, remedies learned from a traveling apothecary years ago and surprisingly effective, then bound the shoulder tightly with clean linen. Throughout the ordeal, the boy watched her, his initial terror slowly giving way to a kind of exhausted resignation. When she was done, he slumped against the stool, his small face pale and etched with pain. Clara heated some jerky-laced broth over the fire, the savory aroma filling the small cabin. She held a small bowl to Little Fox's lips, and after some initial hesitation, he drank, his small hands clutching the bowl weakly. He ate little, but it was something. Afterwards, she arranged some spare blankets and a moth-eaten bearskin on the floor near the hearth, creating a makeshift bed. "You sleep here," she said, pointing to the bed, then to him. "Warm. Safe." He looked at the offered bed, then at her bunk, his eyes questioning. Clara simply nodded reassuringly. She wasn't about to put a potentially feverish, wounded child she barely knew into her own bed, but she wouldn't leave him to the cold mercy of the floorboards either. Exhaustion finally claimed him. He curled up on the pallet, his injured shoulder protected, and soon his breathing deepened into the regular rhythm of sleep. Clara watched him for a long time, the firelight playing over his innocent, sleeping face. He was just a child, lost and hurt. Yet he was also Cheyenne. This act of mercy could bring the wrath of his tribe down upon her, or the condemnation of her own kind. The isolation of her homestead near the Medicine Bow River had always been a double-edged sword. It offered peace from the judging eyes of settlements, but it also meant she was utterly alone if trouble came. And trouble, she felt with a chilling certainty, was on its way. The next few days passed in a haze of uneasy routine. Clara tended to Little Fox's wound, which to her immense relief showed no immediate signs of festering. She fed him, coaxed him to drink water, and tried to communicate with him through gestures and simple repeated words. He remained mostly silent, his eyes following her every move. He rarely smiled, but the raw terror began to recede, replaced by a watchful curiosity. He learned her name, Ka'ara, spoken in a soft, hesitant whisper. He pointed to himself and said a word she couldn't quite catch, something like Nakun or Nakoa. She continued to call him Little Fox in her mind. He was fascinated by the mundane objects in her cabin, the ticking clock on the mantelpiece, the way she ground coffee beans, the smooth pages of the worn Bible she occasionally read. He touched nothing without her implicit permission. His upbringing, whatever it had been, clearly instilling a sense of respect for others' belongings. Outside the world remained deceptively calm. Clara did her chores, always keeping Little Fox within sight and her rifle within reach. Each sunrise brought a fresh wave of anxiety. Would they come today? His people. Or worse, someone else. Her meager supplies would not last indefinitely, with an extra mouth to feed, especially a growing boy. She needed to hunt, but couldn't leave him alone for long. And she couldn't take him with her. He was still too weak, and the risk of encountering someone, or something, was too great. One afternoon, as Little Fox napped fitfully by the fire, Clara was mending a tear in her buckskin jacket when she heard it, the distinct sound of a horse, not her own sturdy mare Bess, who was safely in the lean-to corral. Her heart leaped into her throat. She grabbed her Winchester-checked Little Fox was still asleep, and moved silently to the cabin's single window, peering through a crack in the wooden shutters. A lone rider was approaching, still some distance away, but heading directly for her cabin. He wasn't Cheyenne from what she could tell. He rode tall in the saddle, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a rifle scabbarded beside him. A trapper, a drifter, or someone from Prosperity Gulch. Clara's mind raced. She had to hide Little Fox. If this was someone from the settlement, questions would be asked, accusations made. She quickly but gently woke the boy. "Shh," she whispered, putting a finger to her lips. "Hide, quick, stay quiet." His eyes widened in understanding, a flicker of the old fear returning. She pointed towards the small root cellar accessible through a trap door, hidden beneath a rag rug in the corner of the cabin. It was cramped, dark, and cold, but it was the only place. He hesitated for only a moment before scrambling towards it. Clara helped him down, laid the rug back in place, and then took a deep breath, composing her features into an expression of neutral welcome as the sound of hoofbeats grew louder, stopping just outside her door. "Hello, the cabin," a man's voice called out, deep and gravelly. Clara unlatched the door, her Winchester held loosely at her side muzzle, down but ready. Standing there was a man she vaguely recognized, Jedediah Stone, a grizzled, weather-beaten trapper who sometimes passed through the area trading pelts in Prosperity Gulch. He was known for his sharp eyes and even sharper tongue, a man who kept his own counsel but missed little. "Stone?" Clara acknowledged, her voice calm. Didn't expect visitors." Jedediah's gaze was keen, sweeping past her into the dim interior of the cabin before returning to her face. He was a man in his late 50s, with a beard like a tangled bird's nest and eyes that had seen too much of the wilderness. "Likewise, Thornton. Just checking my lines upriver. Figured I'd see if you were still among the living. Winter's coming on fast." "It is," Clara agreed. "Coffee's hot if you've a mind for it." It was a standard offer of frontier hospitality, but her nerves were stretched taut. Stone grunted an affirmative, dismounting and tethering his horse to the hitching post. He followed her inside his presence, seeming to shrink the small cabin. He accepted the offered mug of coffee, sipping it slowly, his eyes never still. "Quiet out here." He observed his gaze lingering for a moment on the makeshift bed near the hearth, then flicking to the spot where the rug covered the cellar door. Clara's heart hammered. Did he notice the slight unevenness? The fresh disturbance? "Usually is," Clara said, trying to sound casual. "Suits me. Heard some wolves making a ruckus a few days back." Stone said, his voice carefully nonchalant. "West of here towards the river. Sounded like they were on a kill." Clara's hand tightened on her own mug. "They're always hungry this time of year." Stone nodded. "That they are. Anything unusual to report? Tracks strangers?" Clara met his gaze directly. "Nothing I couldn't handle." He grunted again, a non-committal sound. He finished his coffee in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the wind whistling around the eaves of the cabin. Clara waited, every muscle tensed. She knew men like Stone. They were observers, gatherers of information in a land where information was power, or at least a key to survival. Finally he rose, placing the empty mug on the table. "We'll best be moving on. Got traps to check before the snow flies proper." He paused at the door, turning back to look at her, his expression unreadable. "Word of advice, Thornton. Some folk are saying the Cheyenne are restless. Lost a child from Chief Black Kettle's own kin group about a week ago, somewhere up near the Medicine Bow headwaters. They're looking, and they ain't in a charitable mood." Clara felt a chill go through her that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. Chief Black Kettle, a prominent Cheyenne leader. If Little Fox was connected to him, the stakes were impossibly high. "Good to know," she managed, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. Stone just nodded his gaze, lingering on her for a moment longer before he stepped out into the fading light. "Take care of yourself, Thornton. This land, it has a way of testing a body." With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, disappearing into the twilight as silently as he had come. Clara watched him go, her breath held tight in her chest. Only when he was a speck in the distance did she bolt the door and hurry to the trap door. Little Fox was huddled in the darkness, trembling, but silent. She helped him out, her own hands shaking. "He's gone," she reassured him, though her reassurance felt hollow even to her own ears. Jedediah Stone hadn't explicitly said he knew, but his words, his knowing gaze. He suspected something, and his news about the missing child from Black Kettle's band had just thrown a torch onto a powder keg. Little Fox Nakoa wasn't just any lost child. He was important. And his people weren't just looking, they were angry. The uneasy haven of her cabin suddenly felt like a trap. The wilderness outside was dangerous, but the dangers brewing within her own four walls, and the threat Stone's words implied, felt infinitely more complex, more perilous. The isolation she had once cherished now pressed in on her, suffocating. She was alone with a child, whose rescue might very well be her undoing. The ripples from that single act of mercy were growing into a tidal wave. I will now move on to part 3, focusing on the Cheyenne making contact, or the threat escalating a potential betrayal, and Clara being forced into a difficult situation. Part 3. The Converging Storm. Jedediah Stone's visit and the chilling information he'd imparted shattered Clara's fragile sense of security. Chief Black Kettle's kin. The words echoed in her mind, each syllable a drumbeat of impending doom. She looked at little Fox. Nakoa she tried to remember to call him in her thoughts, with new eyes. The small recovering child was a spark that could ignite a prairie fire, and she was standing squarely in its path. The days that followed were fraught with an almost unbearable tension. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to conceal a watching eye. Clara barely slept, her Winchester always within arm's reach. She tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy for Nakoa, whose shoulder was healing well, the angry redness fading, his strength slowly returning. He was beginning to trust her, a tentative bond forming between them. He'd even started to mimic some of her English words, his pronunciation endearingly flawed. He'd point to the fire and say, "Fi," or to Bess in the corral with a questioning "hoo-oo." "Horse." A ghost of a smile would sometimes touch his lips when she praised his attempts, and in those moments, Clara felt a fierce surge of protectiveness that went beyond mere duty. He wasn't just a responsibility anymore. He was Nakoa, a bright, curious child who had, through no fault of his own, become entangled in her solitary life. She knew they couldn't stay hidden in the cabin indefinitely. Her supplies were dwindling rapidly. More importantly, Stone's unspoken warning suggested that her secret wasn't entirely safe. If he suspected, others might too. Prosperity Gulch, though distant, had a long arm when it came to gossip and fear-mongering. The thought of what those rough, prejudiced settlers might do if they found her harboring a Cheyenne child, especially one of such importance, made her blood run cold. One morning, about a week after Stone's visit, Clara was outside splitting the last of her accessible firewood. Nakoa sat on the cabin step, whittling a piece of soft pine with a dulled knife she'd given him. His dark head bent in concentration. The air was still heavy with the promise of snow. Suddenly, Bess, her usually placid mare, snorted nervously from the corral. Her ears pricked towards the east. Clara froze, axe in hand. Nakoa looked up, his own senses, honed by a life lived closer to the rhythms of the wild, instantly alert. Then she saw them. Not one rider, but Fevov emerging from the distant misty folds of the plains along the Medicine Bow River Trail. They were too far to make out details, but their formation, their steady, purposeful advance, spoke volumes. They weren't drifters. They weren't trappers. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Nakoa," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Inside. Now. Cellar. Don't make a sound." There was no hesitation this time. The boy scrambled into the cabin, his small face pale but resolute. Clara followed, ensuring the trap door was secured, and the rug replaced her movements, swift and practiced. She grabbed her Winchester, checked its load, and took up her position near the shuttered window peering out. As they drew closer, her fears were confirmed. They were Cheyenne warriors, clad in buckskin and wool, their faces stern, their eyes scanning the landscape. They rode lean, hardy ponies, their movements fluid and confident. One warrior, older than the others, with streaks of grey in his braided hair, and an air of quiet authority, rode slightly ahead. He carried a feathered lance, a symbol of his status. This was it. They had found her. Clara's mind raced through her options. She could try to fight, but 5 against 1 were impossible odds. She could try to parley, but would they listen? Would they believe her story, that she had saved the boy, not stolen him? Her grasp of their tongue was non-existent, and theirs of English likely limited. They reined in their ponies a respectful distance from the cabin, their dark eyes fixed on the small dwelling. The leader raised a hand, palm open, a sign of peaceful intent, though his face remained grim. Clara took a deep breath. Hiding Nakoa was a temporary measure. She couldn't deny his presence if they searched, and they undoubtedly would. Her only hope was to face them, to try and convey the truth. With trembling hands, she unbolted the door and stepped outside. Her Winchester held in a non-threatening position, muzzle pointed towards the ground. She stood straight, trying to project an aura of calm she was far from feeling. The lead warrior spoke, his voice deep and resonant, the words unintelligible to Clara, but the tone clearly a question, a demand. He gestured towards the cabin, then made a sweeping motion around the area. Clara shook her head slowly. "I don't understand," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. The warrior's gaze was piercing. He spoke again more insistently, and another of the riders dismounted, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. The tension was a palpable thing, thick enough to cut. Clara knew she had to show them Nakoa. To keep him hidden now would be seen as an admission of guilt. She pointed to herself. "Clara," she said. Then she pointed towards the cabin. "Child, safe." She mimed rocking a baby, then made a soothing gesture. "Hurt. Wolves." She made a snarling face and clawing motions with her hands, then pointed to her own shoulder, mimicking Nakoa's injury. "I help." The warriors exchanged glances. The leader's expression didn't soften, but a flicker of something, surprise, consideration, crossed his features. He spoke again, and this time one of the younger warriors responded, then looked at Clara and uttered a single heavily accented word, "Boy." Clara nodded vigorously. "Yes, boy. Little boy." She gestured for them to wait, then turned and went back into the cabin. Her heart pounded. This was the critical moment. She lifted the trapdoor. "Nakoa," she called softly. "It's all right. Come out. Your people are here." The boy emerged slowly, blinking in the sudden light, his small hand clutching the piece of whittled wood. When he saw the warriors outside, his eyes widened, and a complex expression crossed his face. Fear, yes, but also a dawning recognition, a desperate hope. As Nakoa stepped out of the cabin behind Clara, a collective gasp, a murmur of Cheyenne words went through the warriors. The leader's stern composure momentarily broke his eyes, fixing on Nakoa, with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. He dismounted in one fluid movement, his gaze never leaving the child. Nakoa in turn stared at the leader. Then a word escaped his lips, small and trembling. "Ate, father?" Or perhaps it was uncle. Clara couldn't be sure, but the connection was undeniable. The lead warrior took a step forward, then another, his hand outstretched. He spoke Nakoa's name, or something very close to it, his voice thick with emotion. "Nakoa, my son's son." Nakoa hesitated for a heartbeat. Then with a choked cry, he ran towards the warrior, throwing himself into the man's outstretched arms. The warrior enveloped him in a fierce embrace, burying his face in the boy's dark hair, murmuring words of comfort and relief in their native tongue. The other warriors watched their stoic expressions, softening relief evident on their faces. Clara stood by the cabin door, her rifle still in her hand, but forgotten a wave of profound relief washing over her, so potent it left her weak-kneed. They understood. They knew she hadn't harmed him. The lead warrior, still holding Nakoa close, looked up at Clara. His eyes, though still wary, held a new light. Gratitude. He spoke, and though Clara didn't understand the words, the meaning was clear. He was thanking her. He then turned and spoke rapidly to one of the younger warriors, who dismounted and approached Clara. This warrior knew a little more English pieced together from encounters with traders or soldiers. "He kills many bears," the young warrior said, gesturing to the leader. "Nakoa, his grandson, son of his son Little Wolf, who died in the big sickness." He paused, his gaze searching Clara's face. "Kills many bears asks, how you find Nakoa?" Clara explained as best she could, using gestures and the few words she hoped they'd understand. "Wolves," she repeated, pointing to the west towards the rock formation. "He was alone. Hurt." She showed them her shoulder again. "I bring here, clean, food, warm." The young warrior translated, and Kills Many Bears listened intently, his gaze fixed on Clara. When she finished, he spoke again, a longer speech this time. The translator turned back to Clara. He says, "You saved the blood of his blood. You showed courage. The Cheyenne do not forget such acts. He thanks you. He offers you peace." Tears pricked Clara's eyes, tears of relief and released tension. "Tell him, I am glad Nakoa is safe. He is a good boy." Nakoa, still clinging to his grandfather, looked over at Clara, a small, shy smile finally gracing his lips. He said something in Cheyenne, and Kills Many Bears nodded. He says, "You are woman who fights wolves," the translator said, a hint of respect in his own voice. It is a strong name, just as Clara felt a fragile peace settling, a new sound intruded. More hoofbeats this time from the direction of Prosperity Gulch. Her blood ran cold again. She recognized the riders, a rough-looking group of 3 men, led by Silas Blackwood, a brash, loud-mouthed rancher known for his aggressive expansionism and his vehement hatred of all Native Americans. With him were the Cogan brothers, Fitch and Abe, 2 ne'er-do-wells who often acted as Blackwood's muscle. Blackwood and his men reined in sharply their eyes, taking in the scene, Clara, the Cheyenne warriors, and Nakoa, now standing beside his grandfather. Blackwood's face, already florid, darkened with suspicion and anger. "Well, well, what have we here, Thornton?" Blackwood boomed, his voice dripping with malice. His gaze raked over the Cheyenne warriors with open hostility. "Consorting with savages now, are we? I heard Stone jawing in the settlement about strange happenings up this way. Figured I'd see for myself." Jedediah Stone. So he hadn't kept his suspicions entirely to himself. Perhaps he'd let something slip, or perhaps Blackwood had simply twisted his words to suit his own agenda. Clara's brief moment of relief vanished, replaced by a sickening dread. "This is my land, Blackwood," Clara said, her voice steely, though her insides were churning. "These men are guests." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Guests, or are they here for this?" He spat on the ground. "I heard the Cheyenne lost a brat. Looks like you found him for 'em. Or maybe you helped 'em take him in the first place. Kills Many Bears. Though he likely didn't understand all the words, recognized the hostile tone and the contemptuous look in Blackwood's eyes. His hand tightened on Nakoa's shoulder, pulling the boy closer. The other Cheyenne warriors stiffened their hands, moving towards their weapons. "This ain't your concern, Silas," Clara snapped. "The boy was lost. I found him. His family came for him. That's the end of it." "The end of it?" Blackwood sneered, his eyes glinting dangerously. "I reckon it's just the beginning. That boy is leverage. Or maybe just another mouth that won't be eat in our game." He looked at Kills Many Bears. "You Injuns think you can just waltz onto our land, steal our resources, threaten our women." "This is their land too, Blackwood," Clara retorted, her anger flaring. "And no one was threatened until you rode up." The situation was escalating rapidly, deteriorating into the very nightmare Clara had feared. The fragile understanding she had built with Kills Many Bears was being threatened by Blackwood's bigotry and aggression. Fitch Cogan, a lanky man with mean eyes, spoke up his voice, a whining drawl. "Heard tell there's a reward for scalps, Silas. Cheyenne scalps." Abe, his heavier, duller brother, grinned stupidly, patting the pistol on his hip. This was no longer about Nakoa's rescue. It was about ingrained hatred, about land, about the simmering violence that always lay just beneath the surface of frontier life. Clara found herself standing between two hostile forces, the Cheyenne warriors now bristling with indignation and Blackwood's menacing trio. Kills Many Bears spoke sharply in Cheyenne, and his warriors tensed their expressions, hardening into masks of war. The young translator looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a grim understanding. He says, "These men speak with forked tongues. They seek trouble." Blackwood, misinterpreting the Cheyenne's defensive posture as aggression, reached for the rifle in his scabbard. "See? They're looking for a fight. Always are, Silas no," Clara cried, stepping forward, placing herself directly between Blackwood and Kills Many Bears. "Don't be a fool. This will solve nothing." But Blackwood was beyond reason, his face contorted with rage and a perverse excitement. "Get out of the way, Thornton, unless you're siding with them red devils for good." It was a terrible choice. Stand aside and watch bloodshed erupt. A fight that would undoubtedly see lives lost on both sides and ignite further conflict across the territory. Or intervene and risk becoming the target of Blackwood's fury, and possibly the Cheyennes if they misunderstood her actions. Her life had been irrevocably altered the moment she'd heard Nakoa's cry. Now it felt as if that single act was pulling her deeper into a vortex from which there was no escape. The converging storm had broken, and she was in its eye. I will now write Part 4. The climax and resolution, focusing on how Clara's life is changed forever. Part 4, The Reckoning and the New Path. The air crackled with imminent violence. Silas Blackwood's hand hovered over his rifle, his eyes burning with a fanatic zeal. Fitch and Abe Cogan flanked him, their expressions a mixture of malice and nervous anticipation. Opposite them, Kills Many Bears and his warriors stood like stone figures, weapons ready, their faces grim. Nakoa, small and terrified, clung to his grandfather's leg, his earlier joy extinguished. Clara stood frozen in the precarious space between them, her mind racing. Any sudden move, any misspoken word could unleash a bloodbath. "Blackwood think," Clara pleaded, her voice desperate but firm, trying to penetrate his haze of fury. "This is Chief Kills Many Bears. His grandson was lost. I found him. There's no threat here, unless you make one." "Threat," Blackwood scoffed his gaze, unwavering from the Cheyenne. "Their very existence is a threat. Thornton, they raid, they steal, they murder. We push 'em back, or they'll push us out." He was speaking not just for himself, but echoing the fears and hatreds of many settlers. "That boy," he spat, gesturing towards Nakoa, "is probably being raised to do the same. Better to deal with the problem now." "Kills many bears, though not understanding the precise words," caught the venomous intent. He uttered a sharp command in Cheyenne. His warriors subtly shifted their stance bows, slightly raised a knife appearing in one warrior's hand, as if by magic. Clara saw the situation spiraling out of control. Blackwood was beyond reason. She had to de-escalate and fast. She made a split-second decision, a gamble that could save them all or doom her completely. She slowly lowered her own Winchester, placing it carefully on the ground at her feet. It was a gesture of disarmament, a plea for sanity. "Silas," she said, her voice dropping to a lower, more earnest tone. "Look at me. You know me. I've lived here for 5 years. Have I ever caused you trouble? Have I ever lied to you?" Blackwood hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes flicking towards her, then back to the Cheyenne. "This ain't about you, Thornton. Not entirely. It's about what's right for our kind." "And what is right?" Clara pressed. "Starting a war over a misunderstanding, getting yourself and these boys killed, because make no mistake, they will fight, and they are skilled." She glanced pointedly at the Cheyenne warriors, whose stoic readiness was far more intimidating than the Kogan's jumpy aggression. Fitch Kogan licked his lips nervously. "She might have a point, Silas. 5 of them, and they look meaner than a nest of rattlers." "Shut up, Fitch," Blackwood snarled, but a sliver of doubt had entered his eyes. He hadn't expected Clara to so openly defy him, nor had he perhaps fully appreciated the Cheyenne's silent resolve. Clara seized the moment. "Kills many bears," she said, turning to the chief, speaking slowly and clearly, hoping her intent would somehow translate. She pointed to Blackwood and his men. "They are afraid, misguided. Not all white people are like them." Then she turned back to Blackwood. "They just want their boy back, Silas. That's all. No harm was done to me. No threat was made until you arrived." Kills Many Bears watched Clara, his expression unreadable but intense. He then spoke to his young warrior, who still served as a reluctant translator. The young warrior addressed Blackwood, his voice surprisingly steady despite the tension. "Our leader, Kills Many Bears, says this: We came for the child who was lost. Woman who fights wolves saved him. We owe her a debt. We do not seek war with you today. But if you force our hand, we will defend ourselves and our kin." Blackwood shifted uncomfortably. The directness of the statement, the lack of bluster, carried weight. He looked at Clara, then at the warriors, and finally at Nakoa, who was peering at him with wide, frightened eyes. Perhaps even Blackwood, in his hate-filled heart, felt a momentary pang at the thought of harming a child so recently snatched from death. Or perhaps it was simply the pragmatism of survival. A shootout here would be bloody, and the outcome uncertain. "This ain't over," Blackwood muttered, but the conviction in his voice had lessened. He was looking for a way to back down without losing face. "If there's any trouble from your people," he blustered, pointing a thick finger at Kills Many Bears. "Any at all, I'll hold you responsible, Thornton. And you," he glared at the chief, "keep your warriors on your own side of the Medicine Bow River." Kills Many Bears gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement rather than an agreement to a demand. He understood territorial lines even if Blackwood's were arbitrarily drawn. Blackwood grumbled under his breath, then gestured sharply to the Cogans. "Let's ride. This place stinks of Injun." He didn't retrieve his rifle from its scabbard until he had turned his horse. With one last hateful glare at Clara and the Cheyenne, he and his men galloped away their departure, leaving a sudden ringing silence in its wake. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her knees suddenly weak. She bent down and picked up her Winchester, her hands trembling. Killsmany Bears approached her. Nakoa still by his side. He spoke softly in Cheyenne, his gaze holding a newfound respect. The young translator stepped forward. "He says you have the courage of a she-bear, protecting her cub. You stood against your own kind for the sake of peace and a child of another people. This is a great honor. The Cheyenne will not forget this day, nor woman who fights wolves." Clara felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "I only did what I thought was right." Killsmany Bears then did something that astonished her. He reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew a small, intricately beaded amulet on a leather thong. A protective symbol crafted with porcupine quills and small polished stones. He held it out to her. "He offers this to you," the translator said. "It is a token of friendship and protection. Wear it, and the Cheyenne will know you as a friend. It will grant you safe passage in our lands." Clara was speechless. She accepted the amulet, its texture cool and smooth against her palm. It was a profound gesture, a bridge across a chasm of mistrust and conflict. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Tell him I will cherish it." Nakoa, emboldened now that the immediate danger had passed, stepped forward and shyly touched Clara's hand. He looked up at her, his dark eyes conveying a depth of gratitude that needed no translation. He then said something to his grandfather, pointing towards Clara's cabin, and then to himself. Killsmany Bears listened, then nodded. The translator explained, "Nakoa says you gave him food and warmth. He asks if we can offer you something in return. Our hunters have meat." Clara was about to decline, but then she thought of her dwindling supplies. "I would be grateful," she said. "My stores are low." One of the warriors was dispatched and returned shortly with a generous portion of freshly hunted deer meat, wrapped in hide. It was a practical gift, a life-sustaining one, sealing the unexpected bond forged in crisis. As the Cheyenne prepared to leave Killsmany Bears, gave Clara one last long look. "The path you walk is not easy. Woman who fights wolves," the translator relayed. "Your own people may not understand, but know this, you have friends among the Cheyenne. The Great Spirit watches over the brave and the just." With that, they mounted their ponies. Nakoa, safely ensconced in front of his grandfather, turned and waved a small, bright gesture that warmed Clara's heart. She watched them ride away, their figures receding into the vastness of the plains until they were mere specks against the horizon. Only when they were truly gone did the full weight of what had happened descend upon Clara. She sank onto her cabin step, the amulet clutched in her hand, the venison at her feet. The encounter with Blackwood had been a stark reminder of the hatred and prejudice that festered in the territory. She had made enemies today among her own kind. Prosperity Gulch would likely brand her, an Indian lover, a traitor. Her isolated existence was about to become even more so, perhaps untenable. Yet, as she looked at the amulet, she also felt a strange sense of peace of connection. She had saved a child, and in doing so had perhaps saved more than just his life. She had averted a battle, forged an unlikely alliance, and earned a name and a respect she had never sought. Her life, she knew with absolute certainty, had changed forever. The solitude she had once cultivated as a shield now felt different. It was no longer about hiding from the world, but about choosing a different way to live within it. The Medicine Bow River country, once just a place of refuge, now felt like a crossroads. She would be more isolated from the settlers, yes, but she was no longer entirely alone. She had earned the respect of a people who understood the harsh beauties and brutal realities of this land in a way few others did. The amulet was a symbol of that, a tangible link to a world she had only glimpsed before. The future was uncertain. Blackwood and his ilk would not forget. There might be repercussions, dangers she couldn't yet foresee. But as Clara looked out over the vast, wind-swept plains, a new resolve settled within her. She had faced wolves, and she had faced down armed men. She had chosen compassion over hatred, courage over fear. Whatever came next, she would face it as woman who fights wolves. Her small cabin near the Medicine Bow River was no longer just a shelter. It was a testament to an act of bravery that had reshaped her destiny, binding her fate to the wild heart of the West and its oldest inhabitants in ways she was only just beginning to understand. The silence that returned was no longer empty. It was filled with the echoes of a choice, a conflict, and an unexpected, profound connection. Clara Thornton's journey, born from a single courageous act by the Medicine Bow River, rippled through her life and the lives of others in ways she could never have foreseen. Branded woman who fights wolves, she forged an unexpected peace with the Cheyenne, yet found herself further estranged from her own people. Her life was forever marked by that fateful encounter, a testament to the unpredictable and transformative power of compassion in a land defined by harshness. The amulet she held was more than a gift. It was a symbol of a new path, a dangerous but meaningful existence on the untamed frontier. What choices would you have made in Clara's position? What does true courage look like when facing impossible odds and deep-seated prejudice? Her story reminds us that sometimes the greatest changes come from the most unexpected quarters. If this tale of survival sacrifice and the enduring spirit of the Wild West moved you, please give this video a like, share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and subscribe for more chronicles from the dusty plains and rugged mountains. Let us know in the comments what part of Clara's story resonated with you the most. Thanks for watching.